Before the Trinity had its final language, before the Church agreed on who the Holy Spirit truly is, Christianity stood on the edge of collapse. In the year 381, a divided church, a pressured empire, and a room full of wounded bishops would decide whether Christian faith would survive with coherence or fracture forever. The First Council of Constantinople, held in 381 AD, stands as one of the most significant yet unlikely milestones in Christian history. What began as a local gathering of Eastern bishops, plagued by internal rivalries, imperial pressure, and the death of its leaders, ultimately provided the definitive theological language for the Trinity. Today, we explore the Council's turbulent historical and political struggle and the profound theological triumph that followed. The road to Constantinople was paved with nearly 60 years of theological turmoil following the Council of Nicaea. Although Nicaea had condemned Arianism in 325, the decades that followed saw a massive resurgence of various Arian factions. These groups often enjoyed the support of emperors like Constantius VI, who saw a simplified, non-divine version of Christ as a more efficient tool for imperial unity. By the time Emperor Theodosius I took the throne, the Eastern Church was a fractured landscape of competing sects. Theodosius, a Spaniard and a staunch supporter of Nicene orthodoxy, convoked the assembly in May 381 with a specific mandate to provide the forcible measures of his imperial edicts with the moral and legal sanction of the Church. The emperor's primary goal was to restore a unified religious identity to the whole empire, which had been nearly torn apart by decades of doctrinal disputes. The capital city itself was a hotbed of heresy. When Gregory Nazianzen arrived shortly before the council, the Arians held every major church building, and the Orthodox were forced to meet in a small private house known as the Anastasia, Resurrection Chapel. This atmosphere of being under siege defined the urgency and the defensive posture of the bishops who gathered there. They were not merely debating philosophy, they were reclaiming their city and their faith from an era of state-sponsored heresy. Theodosius recognized that the Roman state required a singular, cohesive religious foundation to prevent civil fragmentation. Consequently, the council served as a legislative instrument to solidify Nicene Christianity as the official imperial standard, effectively marginalizing the various Arian subsects that had proliferated under previous rulers who favored theological compromise over dogmatic purity. By gathering these prelates, the emperor transformed a chaotic theological landscape into a structured, legal framework, ensuring that imperial law finally marched in lockstep with orthodoxy. The council's eventual status as ecumenical is a curious historical development. Its beginning was remarkably modest and localized. It consisted of only 150 Catholic bishops, all of whom hailed from the Eastern Roman Empire. There was a total absence of Western representation. Pope Damasus of Rome did not summon the council, nor was he or any Western legate invited to attend. In fact, the council initially included 36 Macedonian or semi-Arian bishops whom Theodosius hoped to reconcile to the Nicene faith through diplomatic dialogue. However, these 36 bishops eventually exited the proceedings in a block, refusing to accept the equality of the Holy Spirit with the Father and the Son. This departure was a turning point, leaving a unified group of 150 bishops who were determined to proceed with a strictly Nicene agenda. At the time, few would have predicted that this Eastern Regional Synod, lacking Western participation and presided over by a bishop not in communion with Rome, would one day be ranked alongside Nicaea in global importance. It was the quality of its theological output, rather than its initial composition, that earned it the title of ecumenical. This transformation from a regional Eastern Synod to a universal authority highlights how the early Church prioritized the intrinsic truth of a decree over the geographic breadth of its attendees. The subsequent reception of its creed by both East and West eventually validated its claim to represent the entire Christian world. This organic recognition proved that dogmatic clarity possesses a sovereign power to command allegiance across cultural boundaries, regardless of the initial limitations of the assembly. Despite its limited geographic representation, the council was an extraordinary gathering of intellectual and spiritual giants, often referred to as an assembly of confessors and saints. Many of these men had suffered physical persecution during the Arian ascendancy and carried the literal scars of their defense of the faith. Among the most prominent were the Cappadocian Fathers, St. Gregory of Nyssa and St. Peter of Sebaste, the brothers of St. Basil the Great. Their presence ensured that the sophisticated theological framework developed in the deserts and monasteries of Asia Minor would be codified into the law of the Church. They were joined by other luminaries, such as St. Cyril of Jerusalem, whose own journey from a semi-Arian leaning to full Nicene orthodoxy mirrored the struggle of the entire era, and St. Amphilochius of Iconium. This was not merely a meeting of bureaucrats, but a gathering of men who viewed theology as a matter of life and death, having witnessed the exile and death of their mentors, such as St. Basil the Great and St. Athanasius. The profound sanctity of these participants lent the council a spiritual weight that surpassed political maneuvering. Many bishops present had lived as hermits or faced rigorous ascetic training, bringing a depth of prayerful reflection to the intense debates, ensuring the final definitions were rooted in mystical experience as much as logic. Their collective witness served as a living bridge between the apostolic past and the institutional future, grounding every high-level debate in the gritty reality of sacrifice. The leadership of the council was marked by transition and tragedy, reflecting the unstable nature of the 4th century church. The first president was St. Meletius of Antioch, a figure of immense personal holiness. His death during the council sessions cast a pall over the proceedings. He was so highly regarded that his funeral oration was delivered by Gregory of Nyssa. He was succeeded by St. Gregory Nazianzen, the theologian, whose presidency was brief and fraught with political tension. Gregory was a contemplative, sensitive soul, ill-suited for the stormy environment of ecclesiastical politics. When his appointment was challenged on technical canonical grounds regarding his translation from the See of Sassima to Constantinople, he resigned in a state of deep exhaustion. He famously declared that he could not bring himself to sit in the seats of the masters, while the church was in such disarray, comparing the bickering bishops to noisy crows. Finally, the council took the unusual step of electing Nectarius, a popular civil official and layman who had not yet been baptized, to the See of Constantinople and the presidency of the council. Nectarius, despite his lack of theological training, proved to be a stabilizing force who could navigate the imperial court and the disgruntled clerical factions. His rapid elevation from unbaptized layman to archbishop remains one of the most remarkable instances of secular administrative talent being drafted to resolve a deep ecclesiastical crisis. This radical shift in leadership underscored the providential nature of the council, where even secular candidates were transformed into instruments of the Holy Spirit. The council was a theater of intense ecclesiastical power struggles. The arrival of the Egyptian delegation brought the simmering rivalry between Alexandria and Constantinople to a boil. The Egyptians, led by Timothy of Alexandria, sought to assert their traditional dominance over the East and viewed the rise of Constantinople as a threat to their apostolic prestige. The council responded to these tensions through Canon 3, which decreed that the Bishop of Constantinople shall have the prerogative of honor after the Bishop of Rome, because Constantinople is New Rome. This was a purely political justification, elevating a seat that had no apostolic origin simply because it was the current seat of the emperor. This move deeply offended the Bishop of Rome, who believed that the rank of a church should be based on its connection to the apostles, patrine authority, not its civil importance. It also sidelined the ancient See of Alexandria, sparking a century of rivalry between the New Rome and the city of Mark that would lead to further conflicts at the councils of Ephesus and Chalcedon. This canon effectively tied church hierarchy to imperial geography, setting a precedent that would complicate East-West relations for centuries. By elevating Constantinople based on political status rather than apostolic lineage, the council sowed the seeds of the Great Schism, as Rome consistently refused to acknowledge this shift in ecclesiastical rank. This tension highlighted the delicate balance between secular prestige and spiritual heritage, a conflict that would define the political landscape of Christendom for generations. The central theological mission of 381 was the completion of the Trinitarian framework. If Nicaea was the council of the Son, Constantinople was the council of the Spirit. By the late 4th century, it was no longer enough to simply say the Son was of the same substance as the Father. A new group of heretics, the Pneumatomachians, or Spirit Fighters, argued that the Holy Spirit was merely a creature, a ministering force or an energy, inferior to the Father and the Son. The bishops at Constantinople recognized that if the Holy Spirit were not God, the entire economy of salvation, sanctification, the sacraments, and the indwelling of God in the believer would be compromised. If the Spirit is a creature, he cannot sanctify other creatures. They asserted that the biblical terms begotten, son, and proceeds do not indicate a difference in nature, but rather different relationships within the one equal Godhead. They concluded that the Father, Son, and Spirit all shared deity or godness, fully and equally. This realization was crucial because it preserved the logic of Christian deification. If the Spirit were not divine, his presence in the believer could not truly bridge the gap between humanity and God. The Council thus ensured that the Spirit remained the active divine agent of transformation within the Church's life. By solidifying this pneumatic equality, the Council essentially completed the blueprint of God's internal life, revealing a trinity of three equal, eternal, and co-glorious persons. The resulting Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed is the most widely used confession in Christian history. While the original 325 Creed ended abruptly with, "and in the Holy Spirit," the 381 revision added the majestic clauses used today. To navigate the sensitivities of the time and the exit of the Macedonians, the Council used a scriptural strategy. Rather than using the controversial term homoousios, same substance, for the Spirit, which had caused decades of war regarding the Son, they described the Spirit's functions and honors. They defined him as the Lord and giver of life, the one who proceeds from the Father, and the one who is worshipped and glorified together with the Father and the Son. This language made the Spirit's divinity undeniable to any reader of the Bible, without relying on non-biblical philosophical terms that might have alienated more conservative bishops who were suspicious of innovation. This subtle approach allowed for a broad consensus that eventually neutralized the Pneumatomachian opposition. By emphasizing the Spirit's work in creation and prophecy, the bishops anchored their theology in the continuous history of God's interaction with mankind, making the Spirit's divinity a self-evident truth revealed through his liturgical and historical actions. This strategic choice ensured that the common believer could pray the truth of God's Spirit without getting lost in the dense thicket of philosophical terminology. Beyond the Trinity, the Council had to defend the integrity of Christ's humanity against the teachings of Apollinaris of Laodicea. Apollinaris argued that the divine word, the Logos, took the place of the human mind or soul in the person of Christ. He feared that a human mind would be subject to sin, so he effectively replaced the human intellect with the divine mind. To the Council Fathers, this was a truncated incarnation. They realized that if Christ did not possess a human mind and soul, then the human mind and soul were not truly redeemed. This defense was summarized by the profound maxim, "What is not assumed is not healed." Since Christ came to heal the whole man, he had to assume the whole man, body, soul, and intellect. The Council's condemnation of this heresy ensured that the Church would view Christ not as a divine mind in a human shell, but as a true man who possessed a human intellect and will, unified perfectly with his divinity. This doctrinal stand protected the reality of Christ's temptations and human struggles, ensuring he remained a relatable mediator. By insisting on a complete human nature, the Council affirmed that every aspect of the human condition, including the rational mind, has been invited into union with the divine through the Incarnation. This affirmation of Christ's full humanity stands as a perpetual safeguard against any spiritualism that would seek to devalue the human intellect or physical existence. The theological victory was the fruit of the intellectual labor of the three Cappadocians, Basil the Great, who died shortly before the Council, Gregory of Nyssa, and Gregory of Nazianzus. Their greatest achievement was the stabilization of theological language. In the years following Nicaea, The Latin West and the Greek East often talked past each other because their words for substance and person were confusingly similar in different languages. The Cappadocians provided the breakthrough by distinguishing between ousia, the common nature shared by the Trinity, and hypostasis, the individual, concrete reality of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. They taught that God is one essence, but three persons, a formula that allowed the Church to speak of the Trinity without falling into polytheism, three gods, or modalism, one God in three masks. St. Gregory of Nyssa, the intellectual architect, showed that all activities of God originate with the Father, proceed through the Son, and are perfected by the Holy Spirit. This linguistic precision ended decades of semantic confusion that had fueled unnecessary divisions. By providing a clear, shared vocabulary, the Cappadocians enabled the Church to move past technical misunderstandings and focus on the profound mystery of a God who exists eternally as a communion of three distinct but inseparable persons. This semantic bridge allowed different linguistic cultures to finally join in a singular chorus of worship, harmonizing the Greek East and the Latin West. The Council issued 7 distinct canons that systematically dismantled the various isms of the late 4th century. They condemned the Eunomians, extreme Arians who claimed the Son was unlike the Father in substance, the Arians and Eudoxians who taught the Son was a subordinate creature, the Sabellians who saw the Trinity as mere names or roles for a single person, the Marcellians who suggested the Son's kingdom would eventually end, the Apollinarians who denied Christ's human soul and mind. By doing so, they provided a definitive boundary for Christian identity. These condemnations were not merely academic. They were supported by imperial law, which effectively banned these groups from meeting within the empire, leading to a period of unprecedented religious homogenization in the Roman world. The thoroughness of these canons left no room for the ambiguous interpretations that had plagued the Church since 325. By explicitly naming and anathematizing these specific variations of error, the Council created a robust defensive wall around the Nicene faith, ensuring that future generations had a clear map of Orthodox belief. This sweeping legislative effort essentially purged the imperial landscape of theological ambiguity, forcing a choice between the historic faith and innovative errors that had long confused the faithful. Beyond merely defining doctrine, this systematic purging transformed the very nature of the Roman state. By aligning the one true faith with the emperor's mandate, the Council effectively turned theological dissent into a form of political treason. The legal machinery of the empire was now tasked with the physical dismantling of heretical infrastructure, seizing meeting houses and stripping heterodox leaders of their civic protections. This era saw a shift from the early Church's organic growth toward a structured, state-enforced uniformity. Consequently, the diverse and often chaotic theological landscape of the mid-4th century was replaced by a rigid, centralized orthodoxy. This Niceno-Constantinopolitan framework became the non-negotiable standard for anyone wishing to participate in the public life of the Mediterranean world. By closing the door on these isms, the Council didn't just win an argument. It established the blueprint for Christendom as a unified cultural and political force that would dominate the West for over a millennium. The Council's journey to being recognized as ecumenical was long and difficult. For decades, it was viewed in the West as a purely Eastern affair. Rome was particularly hostile toward the Council's canons regarding the status of Constantinople, officially rejecting them for nearly 1,000 years to protect the primacy of Rome. However, the creed of the Council, the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed, slowly gained universal acceptance because it resonated with the lived faith and liturgical worship of the Church. By the Council of Chalcedon in 451, it was formally read and adopted as the definitive statement of the faith, effectively merging the work of 325 and 381 into a single, unbreakable standard of orthodoxy. Pope Gregory the Great later famously ranked the Council of Constantinople among the 4 great pillars of the Church, equal to the 4 Gospels. This enduring legacy demonstrates that the Council's true power lay in its theological clarity rather than its political origins. Even when its administrative canons were disputed, the spiritual truth of its Trinitarian definition proved so indispensable that it became the shared heritage of every major branch of global Christianity today. By concluding the long struggle against Arianism, the Council permitted the Church to turn its focus toward the complex mysteries of Christ's personhood, setting the stage for the next great era of ecumenical development and theological exploration. The Council's legacy acts as a timeless reminder that doctrinal truth can emerge from chaotic human assemblies to provide an eternal foundation for the Church. If you value serious Christian history told with clarity and depth, subscribe to the channel, Theology Today. These councils shape the faith you inherited, and join us next week for our third installment on the Third Ecumenical Council, where the Church confronts the mystery of Christ's person in a decisive new way.